Hi folks, Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining me again for a week of talking about history. Thanks for supporting this project as always. This week there is a lot of politics going on the national level, and I'm getting a lot of questions about that and local politics, history of local politics and its relationship to the presidential politics. We actually have a lot of very interesting connections to presidential politics. In East Aurora, for a small town our size, it's quite unusual to have that many connections, and not just Millard Fillmore, who, if you don't know, was the 13th president of the United States who lived here for a few years back in the 1820s and 30s. So we have more connections than just Millard Fillmore. And I'm going to get into that later throughout the summer as we get closer to the presidential election. I know there's been a lot of, I've been thinking about a lot of things with the events of the past weekend with President Biden dropping out and Kamala Harris becoming the nominee, and all the things that are happening with the convention and the nuances and logistics of the upcoming Democratic National Convention, which have happened before, and they've involved people from our local area, which is kind of interesting. Some of the things that might happen, the nuances of political conventions, that sort of thing. So I promise some people have been asking about that, and I will talk about presidential politics. We have plenty of time. It seems like we don't have a lot of time till November, but we do. So I promise to talk about that. Today I want to talk about our horse history here in East Aurora. And the reason I'm talking about it, there's a couple reasons. First is this weekend we are coming on upon reunion weekend. The high school classes, including mine, have their class reunions this weekend, and there's the all-class reunion sponsored by the Rotary Club on Friday night. So this has traditionally been the last full weekend of July, is the what is known as reunion weekend here in East Aurora. It used to be called Racing and Reunion Weekend, so Racing and Reunion Weekend, and the reason is because we have a very rich history in horse racing. That's one reason, the timing. We're the week before of this particular weekend that has traditionally been racing weekend. That's one reason I'm bringing it up. Another is I get as my job as town historian, I'm invited each year to go talk to the young campers at Hamlin Park, the day camps run by the recreation department. And this year I got to also go. There's a new day camp up in West Falls. So last week I went up and spoke to them, and this week I got to speak to the young campers at Hamlin Park. And we used to do a trivia game, and I used to do a slideshow, and we decided to change it up a bit this year. And I just showed up. I just sat down, and all the kids gathered around, and I told them what a historian is and why we have historians and why is it important to study history. And then I just opened the floor, and I said, what are your history questions? And we had an hour to do this, and we actually ran over both times. And I was pleasantly surprised because we have this idea in our head that young people don't like history and that they're bored by it. And in fact, we went over time, and I have some young campers who are going to go home to their parents and see if they can come into the office to ask even more questions or invite me back. So that was exciting for me as a person who loves history. But one of the questions that was asked this morning is, why is there a horse in the circle? And anybody who's driven down to the west end of the village has seen that the horse is back, quote unquote. There is a statue of a horse in the circle. And there used to be one a few years ago where it came about. There was an auction, actually, a fundraiser, where to raise money for a cause, they had these horse statues that were individually, uniquely painted. And one of them was offered for the circle by the person who had purchased it. And there's one outside the Roycroft Inn still. It's been restored. This was several years ago, so a lot of these horses have not have weathered, but some of them have been restored, and so you still see them around town. And then the one in the circle just recently reappeared as they redid the flowers. The garden club does a great job on the flowers at the circle. So one of these young people asked me, why and is there a horse in the circle? And that sort of reminded me of perhaps we take for granted, me who's lived here for a long time and grew up here, and any other long time residents of East Aurora, may take for granted that we all know why we have so many horses around. The logo of the historian's office is the old sulky racehorse. And you'll see the horse on the village logo that was incorporated in as well. And so I take for granted that people know why we have horses as such an integral part of our community's heritage. And there's a very good reason. And so I want to talk a little bit about the timeline of it because I get asked quite a bit, and we mix up some of the history a little bit. But it all goes back to the 1850s when a man named Cicero Hamlin came to East Aurora, and he actually was he and his brother, I believe, ran a general store in at the West End, and that's how it started. And then Cicero Hamlin bought a bunch of land down at the west end of the village, and he had this idea that he claimed to have a unique way to breed horses, a very successful way to breed horses for racing. And some people wrote him off in his early days, but it turns out he was right. And so he bought slowly over the next couple decades, built what was known as the Village Farm. And it was located where Hamlin Avenue is today and North Willow Street. And it actually had a race course, a track, and he had hundreds of horses by the 1880s. And then he bought Mambrino King, who was a championship horse. Did not They called him the handsomest horse in the world. Now that was an advertising slogan that was not necessary. There was no contest for this, but that was a marketing term that was used. A magazine had called Mambrino the handsomest horse, and then it just stuck. Mambrino was not a racehorse. Mambrino was a stud. And when the Triple Crown winners a few years ago were being talked about, and they were talking about horses. I think it was actually American Pharoah. So it wasn't the last one. I think it was Justify and American Pharoah. But they were talking about how after the horse won the Triple Crown, all these people wanted to come see the horse. And they would actually pay a lot of money to breed horses. And Mambrino King was that. Mambrino King was the stud that was horses. They would pay a lot of money to breed Mambrino King, but also people came from all over to see Mambrino King. And Mambrino was actually brought out onto Main Street quite a bit as visitors came to East Aurora. So we also often talk about the Roycroft drawing a lot of people here to East Aurora, but before Roycroft, we were known as the horse trotting capital of the world. That's the term they used. A little bit of hyperbole perhaps with that as well. But that was what was happening. People were coming to East Aurora to not only to breed with Mambrino King, but to see Mambrino King, and that really put Cicero Hamlin on the map. I've written quite a bit about this and about the horse history of East Aurora, and particularly Mr. Hamlin, because he also donated the land later for Hamlin Park. And I am going to certainly include East Aurora's horse history, particularly Mr. Hamlin, in upcoming books that I'm writing. So there'll be a lot more about it. I've gotten into more detail, but Mr. Hamlin pretty much started the timeline of all this horse racing in East Aurora, and he's really the person who started it all. The west end of East Aurora was hopping. People would come in on the train after the 1860s. To come see, and Mambrino King was a star. And actually, Mambrino King's descendants were the racehorses that won, and actually Cicero Hamlin's horses held records and even beat their own records in trotting. So that he was really well known for that. He went on, it is said, he moved to Buffalo, but the farm stayed here in East Aurora, and he had a superintendent of the farms, and he owned the farm. And it is said that he was the richest man in New York State outside of New York City. So he had a great deal of fame. And his horse farm had races and bred some pretty important championship horses. 1904 comes along, and well, before that, actually, sorry, the Jewett brothers got into the business, the Jewett family, and Henry Jewett in particular. There's a whole story with them that I don't have time to get into, but they started a competing horse farm over on Grover Road, Jewett Homewood Road, Grover Road area, and they bought a bunch of land there. And they're the ones that are famous for the covered racetrack. And Henry Jewett, actually, it didn't start out as a mile long, but in the end, it became a mile long covered racetrack with windows all around it, and that was his claim to fame. And of course, that meant that horse owners and horse trainers could train the horses. They could have races in East Aurora, even in the winter when we get these harsh winter this harsh winter weather that we get here. And so that was ingenious. So he was able to market on that. And you could bring your horses to this very unique 1 mile race covered racetrack that was featured in the Ripley's Believe It or Not newspaper column. So that had international fame. So in addition to Mambrino King, later we have this horse track, mile long covered racetrack that was um, built in the 1890s, and then I've written extensively about that. We'll also include it in the upcoming books. But and it was dismantled in 1917. And you can kind of tell if you look at an aerial view of Grover Road and Quaker Road, you can actually kind of see where it was. So the Jewetts have this famous farm at the same time, overlapping with Hamlin. Now Hamlin retires in the early 1900s, and in 1904 he actually puts. Nobody wanted to take over his farm. He couldn't find a buyer for the farm, so he was liquidating the farm. He announced he was retiring, and also at this period of time, the Jewetts even got into it too, where there was some corruption in the horse racing world, and it wasn't as lucrative to do it anymore. And a lot of people were getting out, including Henry Jewett, and at one point he got out of it, and which eventually led to him retiring, and then Cicero Hamlin, and he was older as well, so the farm he retired the farm, and he took the horses to Madison Square Garden to be auctioned. And in 1904, there was a newspaper that didn't last very long here in East Aurora called the East Auroran, and the front page headline in 1904 was of their first issue, Volume 1, Issue 1, was that Seymour Knox the First bought most of Hamlin's horses. So those horses remained in East Aurora. They auctioned at Madison Square Garden. They came back, and Seymour Knox had just bought a land out on what is today Knox Road and Seneca Street, Buffalo Road, and what is today Knox Farm State Park. And it was their summer home. And of course, the Knoxes were famous before they became famous in East Aurora, for their mansion and their lot, the park that is today. Um, the Knoxes were actually owners of stores, five and dime stores that became a chain, and then they sold into Woolworths, and so that's where their fortune was made. And the East Aurora house, the farm that they started, was their summer home. And so they started a farm here in East Aurora, Seymour bought the trotters from Hamlin's farm. So Hamlin started it, and they continued on. Well, as the Knox family generations kept going, I believe it was Seymour the second, I could be wrong on that, converted into polo. So you'll see that a lot when you go to the farm and look at their history. You'll see polo horses. But in fact, the Seymour the First, when they first started the farm here in East Aurora, was trotting horses. So the same horses that put us on the map. So that's the lineage. It went from Hamlin, and the Jewett started, and then the Knoxes bought the Hamlin's horses, most of them anyway, and then it developed into trotters, polo horses, so trotters to polos. So that's the lineage of it. And you go to the Knox Farm State Park, and there's a lot of horse themed things. Well, they were into the horses. But it all started here in East Aurora with Mr. Hamlin before the Civil War, his vision to have a horse farm here in East Aurora. So I don't think the Knoxes would have necessarily had the horses. They probably would have had horses eventually, but that lineage of East Aurora horses goes back to Hamlin, and there's a direct lineage. Now, so that's why polo was played there on their estate for so many years, and the Knoxes throughout their generations kept that going. Now, I read somewhere that now, of course, the Knoxes are also famous for Seymour III about of owning the Sabres, the Buffalo Sabres, the NHL hockey team, and the colors that were originally chosen, the gold and the blue, were actually taken from the silks that were on the Knox's trotting horses and their polo horses. So they kept that color theme. I only saw one source of that information, but it does make sense. So that horse history is carried on. So the reason we have a horse in the circle is because of that horse history that is often forgotten today. And I take for granted that people remember Racing Day. And when I grew up, so it started in 1974, I believe, with so 50 years ago, during the village's 100th anniversary. They decided they wanted to, a committee got together and they wanted to have horse race down Main Street. So they would race trotters. They eventually moved the day to reunion. They had a racing and reunion weekend, and then they would have the horse races down Girard. And then they were discontinued for a bit due to insurance reasons. Plus, it was very difficult to get a committee together. Of course, these types of community events take a lot of work. But the races themselves were very difficult, became more and more difficult to safely do. And there were some insurance concerns. They did do one in 1993. I believe that was the last one when the town was celebrating its 175th anniversary. They did a race down, trotting races down Girard. The Driving Society did carriage drives. A lot of horse-related commemorative events. And the reason we do it is because of what started with Mr. Hamlin, then the Jewetts, and then the Knoxes back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So all communities had horses. Of course, that was the mode of transportation before we had cars. But East Aurora in particular has a very unique association with horses, particularly trotting race horses. And Mr. Hamlin had developed a very unique and very successful and very lucrative breeding system for horses that put East Aurora on the map. And I cannot underestimate, or we can't exaggerate, excuse me, the impact, the number of people that were coming to East Aurora. Today, Albert Hubbard gets a lot of attention for bringing people to East Aurora with the Roycroft after the 1880s into the 1900s. But even before that, people were coming to East Aurora to see the horses, and it was probably even, perhaps in some instances, even more successful. They were coming to see Mambrino King. They were coming to take advantage of the breeding system that Mr. Hamlin had developed, and also taking advantage of the racetrack, the unique covered racetrack at the Jewett Farm up on Grover Road. So that history is sometimes lost because we don't have Racing Day anymore, and people forget. And I remember it because I grew up here, but I know a lot of people who've moved here, and especially the young campers who are at the day camp at Hamlin Park today. They wouldn't remember it because they weren't alive when we were doing that. So I thought that was a unique thing, and we always celebrated Racing Weekend in conjunction with reunion, high school reunion weekend, the last full weekend of July. So that's why the timing today I thought was appropriate. So again, if you have any more questions about it, I've written extensively about the history of the horse racing and the horse breeding here in East Aurora. And I do promise to include it in the books that I'm working on. I'm learning a lot more about it. I know there's some folks I've read on social media who are very eager to have more recognition of that era, and I'm trying to do my part on that to educate and make sure people remember and include it. But things like the horse statue in the middle of the circle today. Give me a reason to talk about it. So I was glad to see that. And I kind of find it interesting that the horse is in the middle of the circle as cars are whipping around the circle. Um, sort of the remembering what it was like down there. There were, again, lots of hotels at the West End. Mr. Hamlin's farm, and then later the Jewetts that came along. The economy of the West End boomed under them because people would come, they'd need a place to stay. There were numerous hotels at the West End, and it just was a domino. So the horse history we have here in East Aurora really developed our economy, particularly at the west end of East Aurora. Even the railroad benefited, so which was at the other end of town. But there were a lot of things that developed out of this horse. It's a neat part of our history, but it was very important to the development of our economy as well. I also have a theory. One of the things that brought Albert Hubbard to East Aurora was his love of horses, apparently, and so apparently he first came to East Aurora in part because of the horses. And then, so I think perhaps the Roycroft would not be in East Aurora if it weren't for the horses that brought Albert Hubbard here. And then Albert Hubbard II was part of, so Albert's son was part of the movement. He worked with Mr. Price, who was the mayor, to lure Mr. Fisher, Herm Fisher, who brought and Helen Shelley to East Aurora for Fisher Price toys. So you could probably even make a link to from the horse era to Fisher Price toys. And that maybe we wouldn't have Fisher Price in East Aurora if it weren't for the horses that brought Albert Hubbard, which of course brings Albert Hubbard II, who helped bring um, uh, uh, Fisher Price toys here. So there's a lot of what ifs and the timeline of things that I like. It's a game I like to play. But the horse, I believe the world famous horses that we had here and the horse history we had here led to other things that are part of our history today, including the Roycroft and Fisher Price. So thanks to the young campers at Hamlin Park Day Camp for giving me this wonderful idea this week. Again, thanks for listening in. And again, your ideas are what I rely on. So pop them in the comment section or send me a private message or stop me when you see me out and about. And thanks again for supporting this project. Again, I'm Rob Goller, the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected to my position as Town and Village Historian. And I do promise in the coming weeks as we get going more involved with the presidential election to talk more about East Aurora's presidential connections and our connections to presidential campaigns. There's a lot of cool stuff that I'd like to share about that. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.